For our last test drive, I'm going to demonstrate to you writing and executing code in the context of a Jupyter Notebook. Now, we'll be working with the Jupyter Lab interface, which is the latest interface to a Jupyter Notebook for working in your web browser. And as you'll see, if you're familiar with integrated development environments for other programming languages, the Jupyter Lab interface gives you a lot of the capabilities of a typical integrated development environment. Now, once we're in Jupyter Lab, we're going to talk about creating a new Jupyter Notebook from scratch. We're going to demonstrate how to rename the file. We'll show you evaluating expressions just like we did in the IPython interactive mode. And in fact, IPython is what's being used behind the scenes inside a Jupyter Notebook to execute your Python code. And Jupyter Notebooks, by the way, are also interesting because they have what are known as kernels for many different programming languages. In fact, just about any programming language nowadays has a Jupyter kernel that you can use similarly to what I'll be demonstrating to you for Python. Now, once we've evaluated an expression, of course, you'll often want to write lots of different code, so we'll demonstrate adding and executing another cell. We'll show you how to save your work, and then we'll also demonstrate how to open and execute an existing notebook, because again, we've provided the vast majority of the code for these videos in Jupyter Notebooks for your convenience. So if you prefer, you can work your way through the notebooks that we've already provided rather than typing all the code yourself. And then finally, we'll talk about how to close Jupyter Lab, and we'll finish up with some additional tips and tricks and some additional information where you can learn more about the Jupyter Lab interface. So let me switch back over to my terminal window here on my Mac, and again, you'll do the same with your command line window for whatever operating system you're using. And you'll notice here that I'm back in the same terminal window that we finished up with in the preceding video. And one of the reasons that I did that is I still want to operate from the examples ch01 folder for what we're about to demonstrate to you. So the first step, of course, is going to be to launch the Jupyter interface. Now, Jupyter is installed as part of the Anaconda Python distribution, and it comes with a server that executes from your local machine and enables you to view contents in your web browser for Jupyter Notebooks. So to launch that interface, we're going to type the Jupyter command, and notice, by the way, it's Jupyter with a Y, not an I, and the interface that we're going to use is the newer interface called Jupyter Lab. So Jupyter Space Lab is going to launch that interface. Now, it's going to display some information in the command prompt. Let me move this out of the way for a moment here. So you can see that it's telling you about the launching of the Jupyter Lab interface, and then it automatically opens your default web browser with the address that you see here in the address bar, localhost :8888/lab. And in my case, it happens to have opened up where I had last left off when I was using Jupyter Lab. In your case, it will open up with the first tab over here on the left, the file browser displayed. And within the file browser, you'll see the contents of whatever folder you launched Jupyter Lab from. So again, going back over to my terminal window for a moment here, I was operating from the examples folders ch01 subfolder, and within that folder we had roll die dynamic and another subfolder. So you're seeing here the roll die dynamic.py file and the subfolder as well. So this file browser is where you're going to manage any of the files that you're working with. And as you work with subsequent lessons, in each lesson we typically are going to have a bunch of notebooks available to you that you can execute execute here in the Jupyter Lab interface, and on a lesson by lesson basis you'll find those most commonly in the snippets_IPYNB folder. In some of the very late lessons we only do Jupyter Notebook, so we don't have a separate snippets_IPYNB folder for you to work with. Now, once you've opened up Jupyter Lab, a couple of the other things that you'll want to get familiar with. Jupyter has its own set of menus within the browser window, as opposed to at the top of the screen here on my Macintosh, which those menus are the menus for the Chrome web browser that I happen to be using at the moment. If you're working on Windows or Linux, the menus for your application may be built into the application itself, but you'll want to focus when you're working in Jupyter on the set of menus that are specific to Jupyter inside the browser window. Now, any file that you open from the file browser will open up over here in the right-hand side of the window, which is basically where your editors will be displayed. And by default, you have the launcher displayed. And what you see here is going to depend on what you've installed for Jupyter on your system. What you're seeing right now is the default set of features, the ability to create a Jupyter Notebook that is capable of running Python 3 code. You have the ability to open a console window, a command line style window that is ready to operate with Python 3. You can even open terminal windows like the terminal window that I used to launch Jupyter Lab in the first place. If you click this, you'll get a terminal window here inside of Jupyter Lab itself, where you can do the same types of command line operations that I showed you previously. And in fact, if I type ls, you can see that you're viewing the same contents here in the terminal window that you see over here in the file browser. And I can actually run the roll die dynamic script from the preceding video right here in the terminal window if I want to. In fact, I can even run IPython directly here in the terminal window and do everything right in Jupyter Lab if I'd like to. So if I close that, I'm back to the launcher window, and what we want to focus on here is the concept of a Jupyter Notebook. So for that purpose, I'm going to click Python 3 under the Notebook heading, and it's going to give me a new file named Untitled.IPYNB. Now, of course, you're typically going to want to name these files your own way. You will want to maintain the IPyNB extension. That is short for IPython Notebook, which is the original name of what are now called Jupyter Notebooks. So to change the file name, you can right-click the file over here in the file browser, select Rename, and as you can see, it now makes the name of that editable. And for this purpose, we're going to call this testdrive.ipynb. When you press enter, or when you press enter, it's going to enable you to save the file with the new name, and you'll notice that the file name has changed over here in the tab for the notebook as well. Now, when you're working in a notebook, the unit of work is called a cell. You're looking at a cell right here. By default, your cell is going to be a code cell, which is a cell in which you can input Python code. And within a code cell, you can type expressions and code statements and much larger chunks of code as well, as you'll see in some of the later lessons. Let's start out here by doing the same thing we did in the test drive for IPython interactive mode earlier. We'll type the expression 45 plus 72. Now, in IPython interactive mode, all I had to do was press enter to execute that code. If I press enter here, it just gives me a new line of code in which I can type more code. So you don't simply press enter to execute your code in a notebook. You hold the control key and press enter to execute that code. Now you'll notice, by the way, this is now snippet number 1 and the output for snippet number 1. in IPython interactive mode, it said in1, and then I typed some code and pressed enter, and then it said out1. So you don't have the in and the out, but you do have the same snippet number that we demonstrated previously. So it's a little bit different interface from IPython. Now, if you want to add another cell so that you can execute more code, you can actually just click the plus button, and as you can see, it's called insert a cell below. Whatever cell is the currently active one, which will have the blue highlight over here at the left, is going to be the cell below which the new cell is insert. You can also, with a cell highlighted like this, use the keystrokes A and B to insert cells above and below the current cell, and there's lots of shortcuts like that that are available to you. So I'm simply going to click plus at the moment here, and that, as you can see, gives me a new code cell. Code cells will always initially have an empty set of square brackets and a colon to their left to indicate that they don't have code that has been executed yet. So let's go ahead and into this cell and make it active by clicking in it, and as we did earlier, let's execute a little bit more elaborate expression. So I'll use the same expression I used in the interactive mode demonstration. So this particular expression contains integers and floating point numbers, and again I can type Control Enter to execute that code. So as soon as you type Control Enter, it reads in the code, evaluates the code, and displays the result for you below the cell in which you entered that code. So if you're working with larger code snippets, you can, or many different code snippets, you can click plus a whole bunch of times to see additional cells, and then you can simply click in each one and add code. If you want to delete a cell, all you have to do is click out here in the margin to select it and type the letter D twice, and it deletes that cell. So you may have noticed that we're one shorter here. I'm going to type DD a bunch of times now to delete these extra cells that I had just added, so you can see that they are no longer part of the notebook at this point. Now, you'll notice up here in the tab that there's a little circle that indicates that we have not saved our most recent changes yet. So you can click the save icon here on the toolbar to save your notebook, at which point the little circle goes away and it's now just an X, which would enable you to close the notebook. Now, to demonstrate how you would execute our existing notebooks, what I want to do is close this notebook and re-execute it. But in order to do that, the first thing that I want to do is to clear out the results that you see here. So in a typical notebook for subsequent lessons, we'll have the code without any of the outputs, and then you can go one snippet at a time and execute the code on your own, or you can tell it to execute the whole notebook. So the way that you can get this notebook into the state that you'll see for our subsequent examples is to go to the Kernel tab and select Restart Kernel and Clear All Outputs. Now, this particular command is very handy if you ever want to redo or re-execute, I should say, the code in the notebook that you're working on. So I'm going to select that. It's going to ask me to confirm that I really want to do that, and I'll click the restart button. And I've found that sometimes I have to do that more than once in order to get it to work correctly. And as you can see here, it didn't clear the output. So let me go ahead and do that again, and hopefully this time, yeah, there we go. Now it did the clear. I'm not sure why it does that. Sometimes it might just be a little bit of a bug, but you'll notice that we've now made changes to the notebook, so that little circle is showing up on the tab again to indicate that we have not saved the notebook. So I'm going to go ahead and click the save button at this point. And now let me close this notebook. So now we're back to the Launcher tab, which always displays if no other tabs are open in the right part of the window. And you can see that our testdrive.ipynb file is still showing up over here in the File Browser tab. So to open an existing notebook, you can simply double click the file over here in the file browser. It opens the notebook, and there's the code that we had input previously when we first created the notebook. Sorry about that. And now what we can do is we can execute this actually a couple of different ways. One at a time, we could click inside of a cell and press Control Enter to execute the individual cell. Or if you just want to see the output of all of the cells, you could go to the Run menu, and you have a bunch of different run options that you can use here, including Run All Cells. So if I select that, it compiles and runs each of the individual cells, showing each cell's output immediately below that cell. So if you want to add more code, again, we can go ahead and click the plus button at this point, and then you could continue on with executing the code. So at this point, what I'd like to do is switch over to the snippets.ipynb folder here for a second, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up the version of testdrive.ipynb in that folder, because it turns out we have a little self-check exercise that you can execute here. So why don't you pause the video at this point, and using the techniques that I just showed you in your version of the testdrive.ipynb file, add 2 more cells and go ahead and execute each of the expressions that you see here for this little exercise, and then when you're done, come back and I'll execute them for you as well. So at this point, we can go ahead and click the cell and type Control Enter to see the result. Now, just like we had in the IPython interactive mode test drive, we're forcing order of evaluation with parentheses, and of course if you evaluate the same expression without the parentheses, the multiplication operator will happen first, giving us a different result from up above. So with that, we've finished the basic introduction to Jupyter Lab. I'm going to go ahead and save the results here on this IPython or this testdrive.ipynb file, and of course you were working in the one that you created, so you'll go ahead and close that one as well. You may want to save before you close it. Now, in terms of shutting down Jupyter Lab, you can't simply close the browser window, because that only closes the window. It does not terminate the Jupyter Lab server. So I'm actually going to open an empty window for a moment here and close Jupyter Lab. Let's say you accidentally close the browser window and you want to get back to Jupyter Lab. You can simply re-enter localhost :8888/lab, and when you press enter, it will reload the Jupyter interface. This is assuming that Jupyter Lab is still, the server is still running behind the scenes. If you really want to shut down Jupyter Lab, maybe you're getting ready to turn off your computer, you can close the browser window. Then when you go back out to your terminal window or your Anaconda command prompt or your shell window, you'll see first of all that it has been logging to the command line here what was going on inside of Jupyter Lab. And to terminate the server, you type Control-C twice. And as you can see down here, it says shutting down the kernels. It shuts down anything that was running. There were 2 kernels because I had 2 separate notebooks that I had opened. And now we're returned, we're returned back to our command line, in my case in the terminal window here in Jupyter Lab. In Mac OS, excuse me. So with that, I just want to switch back over to my PowerPoint slides for a moment. A couple of tips for you to know about as you get into working with Jupyter Lab. First of all, when we executed each cell in our notebook, we typed Control and enter. If you want to execute the current cell and add a new one directly below it, you can use Shift-Enter instead. So that's a nice little additional tip. And also, as you start to work with larger chunks of code that have many lines within them, you may want to display line numbers within each cell, in which case you can select the Show Line Numbers option from Jupyter Lab's View menu, and it will then put line numbers in all of your code cells, making it a little bit easier for you to read the code. Now, there are tons of other options available to you in Jupyter Lab, and we will demonstrate other options as we use Jupyter in later lessons. However, if you like what you saw in Jupyter Lab and are thinking of using that approach as you work your way through our materials, then you're probably going to want to go to this website and read a little bit more about the Jupyter Lab interface before you get started. So jupyterlab.readthedocs.io/en/stable/index.html is going to take you to the documentation for Jupyter Lab, and unfortunately that opened on a separate window here, so let me go ahead and switch my windows and pull that up on the screen so you can see it. So this is the top level of the Jupyter Lab documentation. Now, once you're in this website, let me switch back to my PowerPoint slides here for a moment. There's a couple of different pieces of that website you're going to want to take a look at. Under the overview, you're going to want to look at the Getting Started document, and some of what they show you will be redundant to what I just showed you, but they'll give you a lot more details as well. And then separately, under the User Guide, I recommend that you take a look at these 4 subsections in particular: the Jupyter Lab interface, the working with files, the text editor, which will give you some of the techniques for working with code, and also what are known as markdown cells. Markdown cells are cells in which you can place plain text, and I'll demonstrate that very quickly to you in just a moment. And then just the overview of notebooks. Before we finish up, let me just switch back over to my terminal window, and I'm going to relaunch Jupyter Lab very briefly here. I just want to show you one additional thing that I should have shown you before. So for this purpose, I'm going to let's go back to the home folder, which is where your version of the testdrive.ipynb file is. So I'll open that up, and as you can see here, I still had an empty cell left over. Let's say that you wanted to make some text notes to yourself, and you want them to be notes that the IPython interpreter wouldn't execute if you were to, for example, go to the Run menu and tell it to run all of the cells. So you can click in any cell and change it from code to markdown. A markdown cell is just a plain text cell where you can also use a language called Markdown to add things like bold and italic and hyperlinks and other information into your notebook. So this is a text note. So just some text here. When you execute a markdown cell, it just displays the text inside of your notebook. And markdown cells can have things like headings in them. So for example, if you use a £, this is the markdown notation for a first level head. So if I execute that, it shows up in big bold text. If I hit enter a couple times and say I want a second level head, we call those H2s. Then you can see it's bold and slightly smaller, and you can imagine if you go another level with 3 £, this is an H3, a third level head. And if I execute this, you can see different levels of heading, and there's lots of additional symbols that you can use within the text to format the text however you would like. So you could actually, for example, write a book chapter directly here in Jupyter Lab and intermix your headings and your paragraphs and your code to create the entire chapter of text in the context of a Jupyter Notebook, or if you're an author on a scientific study, you could write all of the text of the study directly here in a Jupyter Notebook as well.